For this list, I'm going to go over 10 of the worst normal spell cards that also do not appear in some of my other videos about bad cards, and then try to explain how these bad cards could maybe be useful. At number 10, we have Darkness Approaches. This card has the effect where you can discard 2 cards from your hand to select one face-up monster on the field, and then flip it face down. It's basically a worse Book of Moon, which has no discard costs and is quick play, so it can be used during either player's turns to disrupt plays. Or if you're a Duel Links player, it's a worse Canadia. But this card did used to have a very unique effect. Before Link monsters were introduced, this card used to have the effect where you discarded 2 cards, and then you got to put a monster face down without changing its battle position. So it was the only way to put a monster in face down attack position, since monsters can only exist face down in defense position. But with Link monsters being introduced, and the fact that those monsters cannot go into defense position, that kind of created some ruling loopholes with Darkness Approaches. So instead of allowing this to be the only card to turn Link monsters face down, they instead changed this card's effect. And this is one of the few cards that had an effect errated, where the card itself wasn't ever good. Now, as to how this card could be useful. If you're playing a deck that needs to discard a lot of cards, like Fables, Infernities, or Dangers, you could use this card as a gimmicky tech option. And that's about it. Number 9, Timidity. This card has the effect where after it's used, neither player can destroy set spell or trap cards until the end of your opponent's turn. Since it's a normal spell card, you have to activate it during your turn instead of using it as a reaction to one of your opponent's destruction effects. Like, if this was a trap card, it might not be half bad, but the fact that it's a normal spell card is what kind of makes it not very good, since you're essentially going -1 to protect your set cards for 1 turn. Which is decent if you're using a deck that really doesn't want its back row popped, and you're going against a deck which destroys back row like crazy. But in those very specific circumstances, you probably have cards in your back row which would stop your opponent from destroying your cards in the first place. Now, let's look for situations in which this card could be useful. If you want to use one of your cards which destroys all spell and trap cards on the field, but you don't want to destroy your spell and trap cards, with a back row heavy deck that also plays Black Rose Dragon, for example. Or if you're playing a deck full of battle traps that get popped in the back row really easily, like a full-on Mirror Force deck. Then this card could be used to protect them and guarantee none of them get destroyed during your opponent's turn, and you get your valued Mirror Force effects off. So, if you really hate Twin Twister, and you love running battle traps, Timidity might be your card. Number 8, Revoke Fusion. Now this card has the effect where you can discard 1 Polymerization from your hand, send 1 Fusion monster from your extra deck to the graveyard, and then you can special summon 1 monster from your hand that specifically is listed in the card text of the Fusion monster you sent to the graveyard. So this card is basically a -2 to special summon 1 monster from your hand, with 2 of those cards from your hand having to be specific cards, as you have to discard a Polymerization. It's not just discard any card from your hand to do this effect. There are some Fusion monsters where you absolutely want them to go to the graveyard, but nearly all of the Fusion monsters that have good effects while being sent to the graveyard, or that you want in the graveyard, don't have specifically named monsters in their card text, or that you can have in your main deck. So it's generally not worth it to run this card for the disadvantage you have to incur to special summon 1 specific monster from your hand. If it special summon the monster from your deck or graveyard, it might be okay, but since the monster has to be in your hand as well as Polymerization, it's almost useless. Almost. Now let's look at some situations when this card could be useful. If you want to get Elemental Hero Flame Wingman in the graveyard, that way you can use Miracle Fusion to bring out Elemental Hero Shining Flare Wingman. Revoke Fusion works for that. So do any of the Fusion Substitute cards though. Or if you use this card and discard Fusion Substitute, since its name is always treated as Polymerization, you can actually activate its graveyard effect to return the Fusion monster back to the extra deck and then draw a card. So with Fusion Substitute, you only go -1 to special summon a monster from your hand, instead of -2. Number 7, Mesmeric Control. This card has the effect where after you activate it, during your opponent's next turn, they cannot change the battle positions of their monsters. A very simple, easy to understand effect. Basically, go -1 to prevent your opponent from changing battle positions, a thing that hasn't mattered in the game since like the very early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, if even that. The card itself is fine, it at least doesn't make you go into extreme negatives and doesn't actively harm you. It's just a very underwhelming effect for a normal spell card. Now, situations in which this card could be useful. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, where changing your opponent's battle positions is very common, with some of the best cards being Paleozoic Canadia and Sphere Karibo, if you're running a stall deck, you could potentially keep your opponent from attacking you for one more turn. And that's about it. It's like an extender for stall decks that already put your opponent's cards into defense position, in which case those same stall decks would be better off just running another stall card, rather than running Mesmeric Control, which requires other stall cards to set it up. Number 6, Level Modulation. This card has the effect where you can special summon one level monster from your graveyard, ignoring its summoning conditions, but your opponent draws 2 cards, and the summoned monster cannot attack or activate its effect that turn. Now, there are some really good level monsters that this could bring out that are kind of worth the drawback of having your opponent draw 2 cards, like Horus the Black Flame Dragon level 8 for example. But here's the thing with level modulation. Even though it says ignoring the summoning conditions, the monster special summoned still has to have been special summoned properly first, in order for this card to bring it out. What that means is, since Horus the Black Flame Dragon level 8 has the effect where it can only be special summoned by the effect of Horus Black Flame Dragon level 6, you wouldn't be able to just mill Horus level 8 to the graveyard with like a Foolish Burial and then use level modulation on it. He would have to have been sent there first from the field after fulfilling its original summoning condition. And then you could use level modulation to bring it back. What you could do with this card though, is send Horus the Black Flame Dragon level 6 to the graveyard with Foolish Burial, use level modulation to bring it out, and since its effect would be negated by level modulation, you could then use level up on it to bring out Horus level 8 from the deck. But at that point, you're just giving your opponent 2 cards for no reason, because there's plenty of other ways to bring out Horus level 6 that also don't require your opponent to draw 2 cards. The only useful situation this card has is bringing out the really strong, hard to bring out level monsters, and it can't do that unless they've been brought out properly prior, which makes this card's inherent -2 nature not worth the effect, and in fact, making it kind of a bad card. Unless you're running a deck that wants your opponent to draw cards and also happens to use level monsters. Number 5, Double Snare. This card has the effect to destroy one face-up card on the field, which has an effect that negates trap cards. So, this card is useful to destroy a face-up Jinzo or Royal Decree on the field. If you're playing against an opponent that really hates trap cards, and you want to have a 1-card way to deal with both of those problems. Which is to say, it's an incredibly specific counter card, and incredibly specific counter cards are generally not very good. What makes a good counter card is one that encompasses all kinds of effects, like Solemn Strike for example. It's a straight up easy payment of 1500 life points and negates monster effects or special summons. Or Ash Blossom, which can negate the effects of one of 3 different situations. 2 really good examples of actual good counter cards that aren't incredibly specific in spell speed 1. But here's the thing about Double Snare. It works on any card which has an effect that can negate trap cards. Take the card Arcana Knight Joker for example. It has the potential to negate basically any card effect, and since trap cards are one of the types of cards it can negate, Double Snare works on it. So if you're playing against a deck which negates basically everything, trap cards are included in basically everything, and Double Snare could destroy it. Potentially. Number 4, Checkmate. Checkmate has the effect where one Terror King Archfiend on your side of the field can attack your opponent's life points directly this turn at the cost of tributing one Archfiend monster. Now, attacking your opponent's life points directly is an effect generally tied to some strong drawbacks. In this case, the drawback of the card is that it only works on one specific monster, Terror King Archfiend. And this card is a level 4 monster who has a summoning restriction, but it does have 2000 attack, which isn't half bad. But the cost of also having to tribute one Archfiend monster in order to activate this effect, which already has a specific restriction, just makes it not really worth using. You're essentially going -2 in order to allow one level 4 monster to attack directly this turn. It just has too much drawbacks while also not giving that great of an effect, which makes it a not very good card in an archetype that was already not very good in the first place, before they released new Archfiend support, and it completely ignored all of the old Archfiend monsters, including Terror King Archfiend. Number 3, Thunder Crash. This card has the effect to destroy all of your monsters, and then inflict 300 points of damage to your opponent for each monster destroyed. So what this card does is allow you to destroy all of your monsters for some mediocre burn damage, as the maximum destruction with this card, at 6 monsters, would inflict 1800 points of damage, which isn't really worth destroying all of your monsters for. Now, what makes this card bad is that it makes you go minus on your field, however many monsters you have, for an effect that isn't really worth it, as it's only burn damage, and generally, burn decks don't summon a bunch of monsters. But there are some useful applications of this card, since thankfully its effect damage occurs simultaneously with its destruction effect. It doesn't actually cause your monsters to miss timing on floating effects. So if you're playing a deck with monsters that you want to destroy, with cards like Fire Kings, or to a lesser extent, Elemental Hero the Shining, this card can proc their floating effects while also inflicting a little bit of burn damage to your opponent, even though there is much better cards that do this as well. Number 2, Gryphon's Feather Duster. This card is very similar to Thunder Crash in that it destroys all of your spell and trap cards, and then increases your life points by 500 times the number of cards destroyed. Unlike monsters, where so many monsters have floating effects on destruction that cards like Raigeki and Dark Hole are almost power crept, spell and trap cards don't really float anywhere near as often as monsters. So a card that destroys all of your spell and traps is inherently a worse effect than a card that destroys all of your monsters. Also, it gives you life points instead of doing burn damage. Gaining life points is one of the worst effects in the game, where at least burn damage actively helps you win a little bit. Now, there are absolutely some decks with floating spell and traps, and some decks that like to gain life points. It's just generally, there's a reason cards like Heavy Storm and Harpy's Feather Duster are still banned, while cards like Raigeki and Dark Hole are allowed in decks. But Gryphon's Feather Duster does have the distinction where its life point gain effect happens simultaneously with the spell and trap card destruction. So, if you do use a Destroy Your Spell and Traps, with cards like Gear Town out, you don't have to worry about missing the timing, where you do have to worry about missing the timing with similar cards like Storm. And number 1, Chosen One. This card has the effect where you can choose one monster card and 2 non-monster cards from your hand, and then have your opponent randomly select one of the 3 cards. If they choose the monster card, that monster gets special summoned, and then you send the other 2 cards to the graveyard. If they choose one of the spell trap cards though, then you send all the cards to the graveyard. So basically, this is a gamble card that requires you to go -3 in order to maybe special summon a monster from your hand, which is just absolutely terrible. Even if it wasn't a random chance, special summoning one card from your hand for a -3 is not worth it. However, ways in which this card could be useful is if you need to ditch your entire hand for like an Eternity deck, or if you wanted to have a small hand and set up your graveyard to use Card of Demise. Also, if you had spell and traps which have good graveyard effects, or have effects when they're sent to the graveyard, like with Metal Foes Fusion or Oja Magic. But since the cards sent to the graveyard with this effect aren't destroyed, they're merely sent there, you can't actually use it to pop good effects, like Gear Town or Dark Coffin. It's basically just the worst way to send cards to the graveyard. And now, for this video, I'm going to have a secret number 0 spot. At number 0, I'll be adding 2 cards, Pot of Generosity and the Humble Sentry. I've covered both of these cards in other videos, so I didn't want to give them their own full spot in this video. But these 2 cards are so bad and also normal spell cards, that I just had to include them on this list in some way. Alright, and that's it for the video. On screen, I'll have a couple of other pretty bad or underpowered spell cards that also could have made the list, but I didn't include them in the video because I included them in other videos. And I think I'll do it like this from now on. If I make future videos that would feature a heavy amount of cards that I've included in other videos already, I'm going to leave them off the list. That way you don't have to hear me talk about the same cards over and over in every video. And I can talk about different cards. So if you have any other really bad normal spell cards that should have made this list, or ideas for other videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.